defense has moved quickly from frontier to mainstream venture. As capital scales into defense and dual use, the real questions are about capability and delivery. Nicholas Nelson from Archangel Ventures and Sebastian von Ribbentrop from Joint Capital will discuss what serious defense investing looks like beyond just signaling. Please welcome Nicholas and Sebastian in conversation with yours truly, Andreas Moncalm, co-founder of EUVC.
Gentlemen, we're talking about virtual signaling and defense here. Nick, let me start with you. You have, for quite some time, been quite vocal about how you're thinking about this. Is the defense boom a real thing in Europe, or is it VCs washing their name in a Ukrainian flag?
I think it's a good question, and I'll say, if nothing, in my fourth time back here talking on the same subject, nothing if not consistent. But with that said, I think your mileage may vary. In short, dual use, especially in Europe, is often used as a crutch. And my company, once upon a time, sold something to its respective ministry or Department of Defense. Thus, go with God, you are now dual use. In theory, sure, but doesn't actually result in any net new capabilities. When we look at what dual use is, in some markets it can mean mainly commercial with some defense, or mainly defense with some commercial. In Europe, it's had, for a lot of reasons we can unpack as we go today, a lot of different meanings. But predominantly, depends on what ontology you use, it involves no kinetics, as well as less than 50% of your market being within the defense sector or defense uses. So that includes respective ministries or departments of defense, as well as big aerospace companies. I think a lot of people in Europe are still uncomfortable for said legacy reasons that I'm happy to unpack about doing defense or getting into kinetics. So you see a lot of funds or companies saying, well, we're dual use or dual use in defense, but really it's about what does that mean? And for us, and what I focus on is I believe the best capabilities and the best financial returns comes from defense only or defense first. And you can kind of look at this a number of different ways, but if you only focus on dual use at the end of the day, it generally in Europe, yes, is a cop-out, and also results in, I would say, below average returns for investors, as well as bifurcated and below average capabilities for the end user. And I'll use a term that I'm going to use the rest of our talk, and I like to use, but really gets down to the brass tacks, which is the warfighter.
Sebastian, that was a very opinionated take on how dual use fits into the defense ecosystem. What's your take?
And I love it, since I also been next to Nicholas for the last 4 years, and he is very consistent, so that's a good thing. And it's very important also for the environment. I approach it in a different way because of the way Join evolved into the defense sector. And basically it came through the evolution of investing in industrial automation, which is also an important part of defense. It doesn't, for me, defense is not only kinetics, but it's heritage in very many factors. And one is targeting software, second can be underwater surveillance, and you see those in the different challenges that are done throughout the world. So there's no different of opinion, but there's a different way I approach it in regards to investing into the market. And I would say I would test the defense-only return multiple. I would say that in a long-term point of view, the dual use is definitely a much more promising case because of the, let's say, dependency on the end-to-end system integrator that you have in that market.
So to those of you that cannot see the energy on stage, we have two people here that very wholeheartedly disagree on many things, though Sebastian tried to say they did not. While we had on the right side of Sebastian a person that was jumping to take the mic and say, I do wholeheartedly disagree. Nick.
Yeah, so let's actually delineate what we're talking about here, which I would never say that defense is only kinetics, because it's not. With that said, when we talk about why we view defense first as best, let's go back about 14 years of historical data. And right now, if you look at early stage predominantly, and we can use banner examples like Palantir, Anduril, Helsing, even more recently, but also you look at the private equity roll-ups, the exits across the board. Over the last 14 years in Europe, so this isn't a US example, this is just on the last 14 years in Europe, defense technology early stage only, and again, keep in mind, this was a wasteland for a long time, on average outperformed by over 60% its dual use from inception. That's not to say you should never be dual use. Let's look at a good case study. We're all familiar with Palantir in this room, yes? Maybe? Okay, fantastic. So Palantir did not have a single commercial contract for the first 8.5 years of its life. When it did finally get commercial contracts, what did it get? It was a bunch of folks getting out of CIA, getting out of DIA, NSA, or Special Forces, going to large oil and gas companies, financial services, who said, hey, I want that same thing that I had when I was in Afghan, when I was in Iraq, and I want to use it there. That then bifurcated their products into what became Palantir Metropolis and Palantir Gotham. Metropolis was the exact same thing, just white labeled. It eventually did evolve and resulted in really positive gains for them into what is now Foundry. But 8.5 years in, not a single dollar of commercial revenue. You can do the same thing for SpaceX. Anduril now valued over $30 billion, not a single dollar in there. So it's not to say you can't go into commercial markets eventually, but if you try to build from inception, and we are an early stage fund, so pre-seed or seed, into dual use, you have two different go-to-market motions, oftentimes two different engineering staffs, as well as different fundamental requirements on the engineering side. So you end up doing both poorly, and you end up getting pulled in the wrong direction. A good example of this, historically, if anyone wants to go through it, is the iRobot case.
Because we got to get Sebastian in on that. What's your take? Why do you say that on the early stage you do actually want to do dual use?
Well, I can only speak of. Is this on?
Yeah. Now it's on.
Okay. So I can only speak of real examples. So if you try, so venture capital is a market on its own. Yeah, it's the most riskiest, probably equity investment that you can do, and so you need, governance, you need law, you need quite a few macroeconomic factors for it to work, and you need customers, and you need to be able to sell it. So Helsing, I don't know who they sold to, but for me, it's still a paper valuation. So I look at revenue. If I have a company that can solve with their software 2 different use cases, whether it's defense or not, I'm more than happy because I can lower the risk in the allocation of customers. I'll give you an example. Underwater surveillance. We have a portfolio company in Holland called Optics 11. It started as using fiber optics to help energy companies pinpoint power surges within larger transformers. You saw what happened at Heathrow. Heathrow went down, transformer burnt. The problem with that is that the civil market takes way too long to be able to implement it, to test it, to pay for testing. And we've seen that in the last 11 years with deep tech in Europe, where the huge opportunity comes with the defense market. So this is Ministry of Defenses that can do contracts up to 25 million euros. For example, Germany, you don't need to go via the MOD. You can go directly to the Bundeswirtschaftsministerium and they can sign up to 25 million, which for me is better than a Series C or D round because it's non-dilutive and it's revenue. But to the point I'm trying to make is that this company was able to attract the underwater surveillance market with the exact same software that used to analyze fiber optics for the power surges for underwater object verification. And that company now has an order book of over 220 million euros without having to do one further round of financing. And that's why I speak about the dual use case. I agree one should focus on one thing only. One shouldn't build parallel teams, but find the opportunity where you don't need to, where you can use the software for multiple cases like Palantir did, but they did have to sue the US government to get their first contract. So did SpaceX, which Anduril, of course, is taking benefit from. So it's not always as easy as that.
I want to ask you both a question that has been on my mind, and that is, as a defense company, will you have to pick a flag? And does such a thing as a European flag exist? And when we receive historically so much venture funding from the States into European companies, is there then a venture journey that will not force you to pick the US flag in the end?
I hope so. But right now, we have to be honest on where we are so we can identify the gaps that are out there. And having spent half my life in the US and half in Europe, I kind of have a foot in both camps, so to speak. We can talk about major European champions like Helsing I referenced before, whatever one, it sounds like Sebastian may disagree here, may think of them, but 3 of their 5 highest positions on their cap table are US investors, despite the narrative. So why is that? It's because that's where the growth funding is coming from. Similarly, we have companies in our own portfolio because, been investing in this space in Europe since 2020, back when I was getting called a warmonger at the same conference a few years back, as Andreas will remember. But we've now seen people gain their Series A, their Series B of our portfolio. And from a valuation standpoint, from a source of capital, it's the Middle East, it's the United States, and a handful of investors over here, but very few true growth. Now, there have been some great funds. I'll always call out our friends over at Plural and Project A, who have followed on to a lot of our investments, but it can't just be that. So there is a gap in the market. With that said, I would say the one thing I am pessimistic on within this market is I fundamentally don't believe there will be a European Anduril or a European Palantir, because it's effectively 30 fragmented markets. Where I do think you're going to find success and champions, if you will, for Europe are going to be those companies that can scale across so-called coalitions of the willing. That's one of the reasons we focus on the JEF region, which stands for the Joint Expeditionary Force. It's a sub-NATO construct, but spans the UK, the Nordics, and Baltics. And that's because of a number of factors to include low prime penetration, fairly low landed requirements in most cases, as well as a greater propensity to acquire direct from startups and scale-ups.
Sebastian, I want your final take on this. Will European companies end up having to pick a flag, and in that case, the US flag far too often?
So I think if you split it into a platform, so a system, they will probably have to, which makes Europe a difficult place to operate. Just look at the drone market or the UXVs, so the underwater and above water vehicles. Every country wants their own, whether it's Fincantieri in Italy, TKMS in Germany, Thales in France, BAE in the UK, and then you have Kraken and a few others trying to break it, which I hope they will. I agree with Nicholas' strategy for the early stage, but when you're going later, you need larger contracts. You're usually a tier level further down the road, and that's why we focus on the subsystems. So basically, to take the analogy of the previous example, the company Optics 11 can deliver to any prime or non-prime. So it's not only the primes, those are the ones that do the end-to-end contracting that are politically dependent, but you have other companies that are smaller, there are around 1,000 of them in Europe, that you can also be a contractor to, and that's where European strengths lie. If you look at the automotive industry or the aerospace industry, you have a huge cluster of Mittelstand companies in northern Italy, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Germany, in France, that just supply that market. And those are the ones we focus on, and they can be also then exported. So we have, for example, Sumitomo and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in our fund. It can also be exported to other friendly nations as South Korea, Japan. So it turns it again into Europe, a global market specialist provider where we're good at.